Talk.
Get some water as well. I thought he set it up really well.
Huh?
I thought he set it up really well.
Great. I'm sorry, Dan, for having such a long video at the beginning, but it's great. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what's going on. It's kind of moving, wet.
It's going on the floor and not on us.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. It sounded like we're going to have no shortage of things to talk about and questions once we get into that part of the day. But if I can, maybe I can't. If I can call you all to order. A bit, kind of. Marvellous. We're doing very well. Thank you. We are obviously, and anyone involved in planning an event will recognise this problem of having so much interesting things that we want to communicate, and yet also wanting to have time to hear from everybody else in the room. So we're doing our best to straddle the two, but that involves some fairly ferocious timekeeping. This second part of the session, as I say, is where we're kind of moving from the very big picture that we were just hearing about to a few very specific examples of urban policies, urban movements, and really periods where we're seeing some very specific improvements in the urban environment and in the lives of the people in it. Now I'll introduce my colleagues in a moment. This is a product of a research project here at ODI called Development Progress. As I say, we are all about optimism here at ODI. And it's a 4-year project in which we're looking across a whole range of different dimensions: health, education, including urbanisation, at some things which work. Rather than looking at what's not working, we're trying to look at what is working. Areas and contexts in which progress is happening, and see what we can learn from that for countries, regions, localities facing similar problems. There's a huge amount of material on the website. I encourage you to look at it. But today we're focusing on that part of the project which is really looking at urban contexts and the areas in which progress is being made from that. So let me just introduce my colleagues in the order in which they're going to speak. On my left is Paola Lucci, who is a research fellow here at ODI, who has been leading a lot of the work here at Urbanisation, is going to be giving a very short overview of the project as a whole, and then talking specifically about the case study in Peru. On her left is Tanvi Bakhtal, who is also a researcher here at ODI, has been very involved in a whole range of different areas of work on this project, and is going to be specifically talking about the research we've done in Thailand. And then on my right is Susan Nicolai, who's the head of the Development Progress Project, and will be talking about the case study of India. We're going to have some here about the presentations. If we have time, we'll have a very short question and answer, but it may be that we're going to then give you all a coffee break, and after that we'll have a panel discussion. That'll be the moment when we really have time to get into the discussion, hear from a group of people here and around the world, and also have much more time for interaction with the room and the people who are online. So let me first turn to Paola to give a very short overview of the project itself, and then talk specifically about what we found in Peru. Paola.
Thank you, Claire. So first, just two contextual points to make. Claire was describing what the development progress is about. And there have been a range of case studies on a number of sectors, but there weren't any that were focusing on the urban context. So we thought that that was missing, and these case studies are filling that gap. We focused the case studies in particular in the challenge that Arama Revi was mentioning about providing housing, improving the living conditions of almost 1 billion slum dwellers. So providing a service household and access to basic services, particularly access to utilities, is what most of the case studies have been focusing on. And before moving just to Peru, let me briefly mention some of the rationale behind the choice of the different 3 case studies that you'll be hearing about. So I'll be talking about Peru, Tammy will be talking about Thailand, and Susan will be talking about India. In the case of Peru in particular, we felt that it would be appropriate to have a Latin American case study. We know, as we heard before, that urbanization in Latin American countries has taken place for a while now. And we thought there would be interesting and useful lessons to learn from the region, particularly given that activities like slum upgrading, improving housing conditions, and providing services to these settlements is often in some of these countries almost a routine municipal activity. So we thought it would be useful to highlight that and draw lessons from that. We thought that Colombia and Brazil, in particular, are cases that have been widely documented, and felt that Peru, on the other hand, was less studied, and that's why we decided to focus on it. In the case of Thailand, it's got a project of national reach of slum upgrading, which is very much community focused, and that's fairly unique. You don't see that many programs that have a national reach and yet have community participation at their heart. So we thought it would be an interesting case study building on that. And in the case of India, we thought in the case of Ahmedabad in particular, that there were different dimensions, the different areas where progress had happened that would be interesting to look at. And also we've seen the chart with the challenges and where cities are growing the most. And as we've seen, Indian cities are one of, India is one that concentrates a lot of the urban growth happening in future years. So we thought India would be another good case study. So enough of background. In terms of the research questions that So in terms of the research questions that our case studies look at, they're fairly similar across them, and it's mainly 4 of them, as you can see. The first one we've looked at, and I'll be talking about, is what is the evidence on some of the improvements on living conditions for existing informal settlements? And as I said, when we said living conditions, I'm really talking about housing conditions and access to utilities, water, sanitation, and electricity. What are the factors that help explain some of these improvements? What are the challenges faced to sustain them, and what are some of the key lessons that can be drawn from the case studies? In terms of the time frame that we're looking for some of these improvements, we're focusing mainly on the last 20 years. It's also worth mentioning that in terms of how we conducted the work, there's been very much a work in partnership with local experts. In fact, the case study has been led by, in the case of Peru, by Julio Calderon, who's an urban specialist in Peru. Unfortunately, he was going to be here, and unfortunately he couldn't make it. And we've been doing both a mixture of analysis of quantitative data where we could get it, and a number of interviews with a wide range of stakeholders. Just before moving to the findings of the 4 specific questions, just wanted to briefly make a note again that very much I think, applies to most of the case studies about definitions and data challenges that we face in actually working on these case studies. So we know that the word slum is used very widely. The MDGs have it in one of the targets, but we're aware that it's a problematic word that can have derogatory connotations, but we find it very difficult to avoid. The different definitions of slums, so we have UN Habitat has a working definition, national governments may have definitions that differ. So that's another challenge that we faced when we were doing the research. And I think most importantly, missing information. It's very hard to find actual data for settlements themselves. To be able to track some of these improvements over time. And where we get data in many cases is patchy, so we might have information of access to services, but we might not have information on living space. This is the case for Peru, for example. Peru has 2 censuses of informal settlements. But they have limited information. So we do have information on access to utilities and on housing conditions, but not on all of them. So we don't have information on tenure or on things like living space. So now, just a bit of background about the country itself. Over the last 2 decades, Peru is a country that's seen striking growth, particularly from 2005 to 2011, it's been growing at average rates of about 7%. And income poverty reduction has been remarkable. Urban poverty in income terms has more than half over the last two decades. It's a highly urbanized country, as I mentioned before. This happened some time ago, during the second half of the 20th century. And in terms of policy, I just wanted to mention a few milestones in terms of the government's attitude towards informal settlements. Broadly speaking, there's been a permissive attitude from the government towards informal settlements. There have been, I think, a couple of milestones that I wanted to highlight. Was one that in the 90s there was a structural adjustment program which had a number of social consequences, and as a result of that, there was a push towards expansion of services to address some of those consequences from these adjustment programs. There's also been most people know Peru, I suppose, because of a very large-scale titling program, which is very much debated in terms of what the outcomes of that program has been. And also in 2006, there's been a municipal certificate, the possibility of actually having a relaxing of regulations so that through a municipal certificate, people can access services. So that's also something to bear in mind when we're talking about some of the expansion in access to, in service provision and access to utilities. So just now, very briefly going through the 4 questions. So what progress has been achieved? So in terms of access to water, sanitation and electricity, I've got some information there from the censuses that the Housing Ministry does and the information they collect. And as you can see, it's only available for a very short time frame, so it's 2002 to 2007. But you can see that there has been remarkable increases in access to water, sanitation and electricity. This is all for informal settlements in the country. In terms of housing conditions, which is the other point that I mentioned we were considering under living conditions, we can see again that improvements in terms of the building materials used for housing and some reductions in terms of, for example, mud floors between the period that we have data for. Obviously, access to these to services like the utilities I mentioned and better housing conditions have a wider set of impacts, from impacts on family budgets in terms of having to pay less for services. In some cases, 4 to 8, buying, for example, water from tanker tracks or from neighbours can be 4 to 8 times more expensive than having a connection. Obvious impacts on health as well, on time actually to go and fetch water, and in the possibility of having, for example, home-based activities. So now moving to some of the factors. How am I doing? A couple of minutes. Okay. Some of the factors driving these improvements. We identified mainly 3. So one has been an expansion in government programs in terms of provision of water, sanitation and electricity services. As I mentioned, this was to a certain extent a political calculation after the structural adjustment program, and to address some of those social costs, these massive expansion of services followed. In terms of, and as I mentioned before, there's since 2006 there's this possibility of having access to services by having a certificate from the municipality, so there's no need to have a title deed to be able to access services. In terms of, there have also been housing programs supporting, for example, self-building. So provided, again, this requires people to already have a plot, but there would be subsidies to self-build. So that's one of the factors. A second factor is pressure exerted from neighbourhood organisations themselves to get access to these services. So they've been, and this came through many of the interviews that we've done, where neighbourhoods have put pressures on authorities at different levels, so Ministry of Housing, municipalities, to push for access to these services. So that's been a key factor in actually this expansion of provision. And thirdly, the third factor we've identified is related to efforts that households themselves have made to improve their own housing conditions. So, as I was mentioning, over the last 20 years, the macroeconomic environment has been fairly positive. Many people in this area still have very precarious jobs, but there are jobs. And some of those savings are used, there's some of the findings from the interviews are very in line with the literature on household level strategies and how families club together, have many different works and use different occupations and use those savings to upgrade their housing conditions. They use their networks, family networks, to build those houses or to get loans to buy the materials to improve those housing conditions. So that's the third factor. Just moving briefly to challenges and some of the lessons that we drawn from the case study. In terms of challenges, we've highlighted 4. One of them is that despite improvements, so there's a heterogeneity in the slum settlements. So despite improvements, particularly in older settlements, in flatter areas, there's a whole new range of settlements in steeper areas, and they are located also in areas where these are high-risk areas. So some of them, are not particularly well conditioned for living there. So that's one of the main challenges. Clientelistic behaviour by the state. So as I mentioned, there's been a lot of expansion of these services, but the engagement between the state and citizens is often of a clientelistic nature. Inequality in access to opportunities. So as I mentioned, a lot of despite the economic growth, a lot of the jobs available are still precarious in the informal sector. Access to good quality education for many of the residents in these areas is a challenge. So that remains a key issue despite the strong economic performance. And then just a point about more technical and geeky about data, but it is an issue that, we're talking about data released in 2014, but it refers to 2007. So it's been 7 years. So we don't really know what happened since then. And very limited in terms of the geographical areas that we can disaggregate that data for. So for other cities in Peru, we don't have that level of information, and the types of variables that are covered. And just to conclude, some 4 lessons. First one about, as I mentioned, one of the key drivers was communities themselves pushing for these improvements and expansion of provision of services. So there's a need to support and strengthen that work. Another lesson has been that, as I mentioned, there's been motivated by political reasons, but there's been commitment to expand these services by government. And thirdly, that in addition to focusing on improvements of existing settlements, it's really important to also think more broadly, and I think this is what's been a challenge in the case of Peru, think more broadly about urban planning and thinking about access to affordable land and housing. And finally, something that's been already mentioned about the local capacity, particularly of municipalities, to deal with these issues. And I think we've seen, in the case of Peru, there's been some decentralization, but still very weak capacities in terms of urban planning. So that's another point to highlight. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Paula. That was fascinating. Before I turn to Tanvi to talk about Thailand, I wonder if we don't really have time for questions, but I can't resist with so much expertise in the room. I wonder if there is one Peru expert in the room who would like to very briefly and off the cuff offer a quick reaction to that. Do you recognise that? Are there things that we've missed out, things that the ordering that we've got wrong? Just very interested to know someone in the room who would like to offer a very, very brief comment or response to that. If there isn't anyone, we shall move swiftly on to Thailand. Okay, right, you can prepare. Now you know that I'm going to be asking that again after the Thailand and the India case studies, so anyone who has expertise in those areas, you can get ready. Tanvi, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, good.
Thanks, Claire.